3. B24 Liberator. Developed during the early stages of World War II, the consolidated B-24 Liberator holds the title of being the most produced American-made military aircraft of all time. Nearly 19,000 units rolled off the line between 1940 and 1945. It saw extensive use throughout the war as a heavy bomber. The first shipment of B-24 Liberators entered service for the British Royal Air Force, RAF, in 1941. They were the first planes to routinely fly across the Atlantic Ocean between Europe and North America, and they fulfilled a variety of roles, including as cargo carriers and air transports. Despite its popularity and versatility, the B-24 Liberator was less than ideal for a number of reasons. It was difficult to fly and performed poorly at low speeds compared to other bombers at the time. The aircraft was nevertheless critical to the Allied war effort, serving in every branch of the U.S. military along with the armies, navies, and air forces of numerous other countries. It played a primary role in the American strategic bombing campaigns in the Western European and Pacific theaters. Throughout the conflict, thousands of B-24s dropped hundreds of thousands of tons of explosives on Axis military and industrial targets. One American unit, known as the 44th Bombardment Group, used its B-24 bombers to carry out 344 missions against the Axis powers starting in November 1942. The B-24 was also used by the U.S. Army Air Forces to carry out a major attack on the Axis-controlled oil fields and refineries around Ploiești, Romania. On August 1, 1943, nearly 200 Liberators descended on the city as part of Operation Tidal Wave, which sought to destroy the refinery that supplied up to 60% of the Axis powers fuel. The attack only lasted around 30 minutes, but it turned out to be the aircraft's costliest mission, with 52 of the planes being shot down. In addition to participating in conventional combat, the B-24 was used to carry out classified missions. In early 1944, the U.S. Army Air Forces and a former American intelligence agency, known as the Office of Strategic Services, collaborated to drop weapons and other supplies to French resistance fighters in a mission codenamed Operation Carpetbagger. By the time the war ended, the B-24 and other early bombers had been rendered obsolete by newer aircraft. There are only 13 known surviving Liberators today, and some of them are only partially intact. A handful of others remain scattered in various parts of the world where they crashed decades earlier. One can be found in Alaska's Aleutian Islands, where it crash-landed in 1942 while on weather reconnaissance duty, due to bad conditions, which prevented it from landing in a nearby airfield. The pilot managed to land the aircraft safely on its belly even after the tail broke off in mid-air. All crew members walked away uninjured, except Brigadier General William E. Lind, who suffered a broken collarbone. They spent the night at the crash site, where they luckily had a supply of food to stave off hunger and enough supplies to start a fire. Another B-24 Liberator, nicknamed Heaven Can Wait, was shot down over Papua New Guinea in 1944 during a mission to disrupt a Japanese supply chain. The aircraft and its 11-member crew remained missing for more than 70 years. Experts finally located the wreck 200 feet or 61 meters underwater at the bottom of Hansa Bay. While surveying fire damage in 1994, a park ranger discovered a long-missing B-24 wreck in Australia's Crumbit Tops National Park. Nicknamed Beautiful Betsy, the plane had suffered previous damage and was only being used for short flights when it disappeared somewhere between Darwin and Brisbane, taking 6 American soldiers and 2 British service members with it. Numerous search expeditions failed to find the men or the missing B-24. When the wreck was finally found, the crew members' remains were recovered at the site. There's another B-24 sitting at an elevation of 12,637 feet, or 3,852 meters, on Arizona's tallest mountain, Humphreys Peak. The aircraft was being flown by a U.S. Army Air Corps crew one night in 1944 when it crashed into the mountainside, landing on a bed of boulders in a remote area that's extremely difficult to get to. All 8 crew members died, and the B-24 was destroyed. During the 1950s, the United States Forest Service USFS apparently got tired of hikers mistaking the wreck as recent and reporting it, so they blew it up with dynamite to further scatter the debris and make it clear that what's left of the plane had been sitting there for quite some time. Today, only parts of the aircraft are recognizable, including some engine parts and a nearly intact wing. These are just a handful of the mostly destroyed B-24 remnants that dot the globe. They serve as a reminder of an era when fighter aircraft were in their infancy and the enormous cost in human lives that the war's Allied victory came at. Have you ever been to a war museum? Tell us in the comments below and hit subscribe while you're at it. 2. Sukhoi Su-15. Known by its NATO code name, Flagon, the Soviet-built Sukhoi Su-15 supersonic jet was developed in the early 1960s to replace its aging and unreliable predecessors, the Su-9 Fishpot and Su-11 Fishpot-C. Its main purpose was to intercept the American-made Boeing B-52 Stratofortress and the Lockheed U-2, as well as the V-bombers of the British Royal Air Force. The Su-15 wasn't the Soviet Union's fastest supersonic aircraft, nor was it designed to intercept the most formidable of enemy targets. As a Cold War-era fighter jet, it also never saw combat, so it's impossible to say how it would have performed in the event of actual warfare. But it fulfilled its purpose and was a frontline design of the Soviet Air Force from the time it entered service in 1965 to its retirement in 1993. The aircraft was equipped with sophisticated radar and a variety of other systems that enabled it to respond to threats with precision, efficiency, and effectiveness. It also had a fast climb rate and could maintain high speeds at high altitudes. Despite its strengths, the Su-15 fell short in several ways. Its radar lacked look-down, shoot-down capability, which, unlike conventional radar, continues working even when it's pointed at the ground. In an era that saw the development of new low-flying bombers, having radar that could focus downward was imperative. Consequently, the Su-15 eventually fell to the back burner in favor of the more advanced MiG-23P fighter aircraft, but it remained in service until the Iron Curtain collapsed. In addition to any operational weaknesses it may have had, the Su-15 was involved in several controversial encounters with civilian airliners during its career. As a result, it became known as the Boeing Killer, and not in the context that the Soviet Union would have liked. The first incident happened in 1978, when a Korean Airlines Flight 902 crossed over into Soviet airspace over Murmansk. An Su-15 struck the Boeing 707 with a missile, and while the damaged commercial aircraft survived the hit and the forced landing it made on a frozen lake, the two passengers did not. Just a handful of years later, in 1983, a Boeing 747 jumbo jet flying under Korean Airlines veered into restricted airspace near Monorun Island in the Soviet Union's Far East region. An Su-15 pilot fired at the plane and struck its tail, disabling the aircraft's control surfaces. The 747 plunged into the Sea of Japan, killing all 256 passengers and 23 crew members. In the tragedy's aftermath, Soviet authorities accused the aircraft of being on a spy mission and claimed that its crews ignored orders to land. Then President Ronald Reagan was unconvinced and condemned the incident as an act of Soviet barbarism. The Su-15 was also eventually tied to the death of Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, the first man to ever travel to space. Gagarin passed away under mysterious circumstances in 1968, and his death remained shrouded in mystery for 45 years until 2013, when the details were finally released to the public. As it turned out, a malfunctioning Su-15 came dangerously close as it passed an MiG-15 being flown by Gagarin, forcing him to make a sharp turn to avoid colliding. He lost control of the aircraft as it went into a spiral and crashed into the ground. The Su-15 nevertheless remained in service for years to come. It was abruptly retired in 1993 to comply with the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe, which imposed limits on certain military equipment in Europe and mandated the destruction of excess machinery. Most Su-15s were scrapped, but a few were stored for emergency use. In 2014, severe flooding struck the city of Magadan in Russia's Far East. Photos that appeared online showed the city's overflowing river washing away 2 severely damaged Su-15s, which were plucked from the water and scrapped. Today, there are at least a handful of Su-15s languishing in various states of neglect, in fields and outside derelict buildings throughout Russia, including at the defunct Kodinka Aerodrome Airport in Moscow. 1. Boeing 747. After losing out on a military contract to develop an oversized jet during the 1960s, executives at Boeing brainstormed how they could sell their idea to the civilian market. They had good timing. Passenger flight was booming, and existing airlines were struggling to keep up with customer demand. At the same time, commercial flying was gaining popularity among the American middle class, but it was still pretty expensive. Boeing responded to these circumstances by repurposing its military jet as a passenger aircraft and marketing it as a way to make flying more affordable and to relieve the growing problem of airport congestion. The company rolled its finished product into public view for the first time in 1968. Famously known as the 747, it was the world's first ever jumbo jet, and it was unlike any aircraft anyone had ever seen before. Measuring 231 feet, 70 meters long, and with a wingspan of 195 feet, 59 meters, and a tail as high as a 6-story building, spectators were awestruck by the aircraft's sheer size. The bi-level passenger plane ushered in a new era of flight travel, and remains iconic today for its distinctive hump and its colossal proportions, which have been exceeded by just a handful of other passenger airliners. Powered by 4 Pratt & Whitney turbofan engines, the 747 typically accommodated 366 passengers, spread across 3 classes. The plane's earlier versions used the upper level as premium lounge space, with some even offering live piano music. Airlines eventually did away with the lounges in favor of squeezing more seats onto the aircraft. Some variants, like the 747-400, had room for as many as 400 or even 500 or more passengers. As predicted, the advent of the jumbo jet achieved its goals of relieving airport congestion and making travel more affordable. It was no longer a luxury afforded mainly to the affluent and wealthy classes, but something that fell within the average person's budget. For travelers, the lower costs meant being able to visit far-flung destinations that were once extremely costly or difficult to reach. And for airliners, it meant more passengers, and therefore more sales and increased profits. In the meantime, the 747 continued catering to travelers who could afford to fly in style. Nicknamed the Queen of the Skies, it went down in history as one of the most successful commercial planes of all time. Over 1,500 747s were built during its production years. And while all US-based airlines have discontinued their use of the aircraft, it continues to fly both commercially and as a cargo jet more than 50 years after it entered service. But its use is admittedly declining, and aviation experts have been warning for years that the era of the jumbo jet is coming to an end. The airline industry has struggled with decreased ridership numerous times over the last few decades, including after the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Towers in 2001, during the global recession of 2008 and 2009, and more recently when the COVID-19 pandemic brought life around the world to a virtual standstill. Between rising fuel costs and less travelers, it became increasingly difficult for airlines to keep their jumbo jets profitable. At the same time companies were taking their 747s out of service, they also stopped ordering more. Those who continued using jumbo jets increasingly turned to more modern and fuel-efficient models. Shipping companies also began opting for different aircraft, and in December 2022, the final Boeing 747 rolled off the production line in Everett, Washington. Today, there are more 747s on the ground than there are in the sky. Many sit quietly tucked away in large storage facilities called boneyards, where they arrived during the COVID-19 pandemic with an uncertain future. Others languish outside airports, in fields, and wherever else they can fit, slowly crumbling to the effects of time while they wait to either be repurposed or scrapped. In 2019, The Bahraini government sank a 747 into the Parisian Gulf as a scuba diving attraction. More recently, a museum owner in Oregon has vowed to restore a derelict 747 sitting outside its facility as a permanent exhibit for visitors. The aircraft will always remain iconic in its own right, but it's far more likely to become a closed chapter in history than it is to relive the popularity of its glory days.
8. The Explorer. The Explorer is one of the oldest known submarines to still exist today. The submarine Explorer was built in Brooklyn by Julius Hermann Kroll from between 1863 and 1865. In 1866, she underwent tests in the East River in New York. Although the tests went well, attempts to sell the vessel to the US Navy fell through. However, the Explorer would quickly find another buyer and be shipped down to Panama. In order to do this, the Explorer was first broken down into pieces. It was then delivered by boat to Panama before being taken by steam train to the Pacific Ocean. Once she arrived there, she was painstakingly reconstructed for her new job as a pearl diving vessel. The submarine's construction was innovative for the time. Her hull was separated into 3 sections: a compressed air chamber beneath the upper hull, an internal working room for the crew, and 10 ballast tanks. Once at the required depth, the crew would be able to open hatches in the working room and explore the seafloor, gathering oysters and pearls. It wasn't a mechanical failure that led to the abandonment of the Explorer. It was due to a human mistake. In the late 1800s, the consequences of pressure on the human body caused by diving in deep water for a prolonged period of time were unknown. This was also the case when it came to decompression sickness, often known as caisson illness or the bends. This is caused by a buildup of nitrogen in the body that can prove fatal if not treated properly and quickly. After completing some dives for pearls and oysters off of Isla San Telmo in 1869, the crew became sick and died. Local reports at the time claimed that the team had been diving at depths of over 100 feet for hours on end before quickly resurfacing. Their cause of death was later determined to be from decompression sickness. A cure for the disease wouldn't be found until 1907, 38 years too late. The submarine Explorer was abandoned in a cove in San Telmo Bay, where it sat undiscovered until the year 2000. A rusting shell of what it once was, the submarine is still there to this day. 7. The River Medway subs. The River Medway in the UK isn't a place where you'd expect to find abandoned submarines. However, dozens of them can be found throughout the river. People crossing the Rochester Bridge by train or car may have observed a Russian submarine to the north of the bridge, just off the town of Shrewd. The U-475 Black Widow was a Cold War submarine that was retired from service and sold in 1994. It spent the next 4 years on the River Thames in England as a floating museum. Then in 1998, it was moved to Folkestone, where it was once again open to the public. In 2004, it ended up in Strood to be repaired and destroyed. But since then, no work has been done on the vessel, and it still sits abandoned to this day. Another submarine that can be found in the River Medway is the U-122 that was used by the German Army during World War I. Following their defeat in 1918, U-122 was given to the UK as part of the war reparations between the two countries. With no use for the vessel after the war was over, it was towed through the river in order to be scrapped. However, U-122 broke loose when it was being towed. Instead of going back to recover it, the decision was made to simply leave it where it was. Although this might seem unthinkable today, it was the most sensible decision at the time. After World War I, the abundance of scrap metal out there made the price and demand for it incredibly low. It simply would have cost more to recover the vessel than it would be worth in scrap metal value. The 251-foot long submarine has now spent over 100 years rusting away in the mudflats of the river. And surprisingly, there's a lot of people living in the area that don't even know it's there. Although these are some of the more notable finds along the River Medway, at least 26 more submarines are thought to be abandoned here after being bought for scrap metal following the conclusion of World War I. 6. Abal Lady Bay. Abal Lady Bay is located on the coast of Scotland, just a 40-minute drive away from the country's capital of Edinburgh. It was the very first area in the UK to be designated as a nature reserve in 1952 But that's not the only thing that makes it special. Abal Lady Bay is also home to 2 abandoned World War II-era submarines. The pair of X-class midget submarines are mostly hidden in the sand, giving them the appearance of big boulders. They've also deteriorated significantly. However, numerous details may still be recognized if you look closely enough. But how did they end up in Abal Lady Bay? The 2 submarines weren't destroyed in a battle, but they definitely underwent some heavy beatings. They were towed to their current location in 1946, and each was tethered to a heavy concrete block to stop it from floating away. The vessels were then used for target practice, and they were fired upon by Royal Air Force pilots to see how their bullets would hold up when it came to taking down submarine hulls. One of the submarines has fared better than the other, and more features can be picked out on its exterior, such as its hatch. Both subs are often submerged by sea, but the best chance to see them is at low tide as they slowly emerge from the water. 5. USS Ling. The USS Ling is a US Navy Ballo-class submarine that was constructed in 1943 by the Philadelphia-based Cramp Shipbuilding Company. It's one of 5 surviving submarines of this class that still exists today. It was launched in 1945 as it entered military service in World War II. Less than a year later, the war ended, and the USS Ling was decommissioned. It wasn't abandoned just yet though. After the war, it was designated as part of the Atlantic Reserve Fleet until 1960. It was then used as a training vessel at the Brooklyn Navy Yard until 1971. After it had served its purpose at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, the USS Ling was set to be scrapped. However, she was rescued by the Submarine Memorial Association and was transported to Hackensack, New Jersey to become a floating museum. Unfortunately, tragedy would strike in 2012 when Hurricane Sandy swept across the United States. The Hackensack River was flooded, which in turn damaged the submarine and the museum. By 2016, the museum was forced to close, and because the USS Ling sprung a leak in 2018, it's unlikely that it'll be restored anytime soon. If you were able to name your very own submarine, what would you call it? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe while you're at it. 4. U-352. The U-352 was a German submarine that was employed during the infamous U-boat assaults along the North Carolina coast during World War II. U-352 was a member of Group Schley and was instructed, along with 12 other U-boats, to congregate west of Rockall and begin scouting for convoys in April 1942. Because of the offensive building up of the United States East Coast, this mission was cancelled shortly after it was launched. U-352 would return to the East Coast that next month, where it would unsuccessfully attempt to take down a Swedish merchant ship known as the SS Friden. Over the course of 2 days, 4 torpedoes would be launched from the U-352 at the Friden, with each one missing its target. However, the crew evacuated onto life rafts just in case, and the captain turned the ship head-on towards the U-boat. Although this was done to make the Friden a smaller target, the German submarine's crew thought they were getting ready to ram them at full speed, so they cooled off their attack. After floating in the water on their lifeboats for a few hours, the crew of the SS Friden would drift past their untouched ship and reboard. They then continued on their journey as if nothing had happened. On May 9, 1942, U-352 would spot its next target. However, this engagement would also be unsuccessful, eventually leading to its demise. Icarus, a 165-foot United States Coast Guard cutter, was observed by the sub's crew near Cape Lookout, and so they moved in to attack. The U-boat fired a torpedo, but they missed again. The Icarus, however, was right on target. It fired 5 depth charges from its Y-gun, which severely damaged U-352. The German sub then tried faking its death by laying motionless on the bottom of the ocean, hoping that Icarus would move on. However, it continued to fire depth charges, forcing the submarine to the surface. With a burst of heavy machine gun fire, U-352 was sunk, making it the first German U-boat to be lost during the Battle of the Atlantic. The wreck remained undiscovered until 1974, when it was located by Captain George Purifoy and his associates. These days, the wreckage of U-352 is a popular dive site filled with marine life. 3. Questa 1. Questa 1 is otherwise known as the Yellow Submarine. It was built in 1967 out of scrap metal in Brooklyn, New York by Jerry Bianco. His aim was to use the vessel to travel to the SS Andrea Doria, a famous shipwreck of a cruise liner. He wanted to salvage some of the valuable items still left on board, which included things like unopened safes, diamonds, and other precious metals. Bianco's idea was to dive down to the wreck using Questa 1. Then he would install inflatable dunnage bags inside the sunken ship. The cruise liner would then rise to the surface once the bags were filled with enough air, allowing it to be towed to a safer location where it could be salvaged of its riches. The Questa 1 was painted bright yellow, not out of reference to a famous Beatles song, but because it was the shade that Bianco could get the best deal on. The submarine was ready to launch in 1970, and it was lowered into the waters off of Coney Island by a crane. However, as it was being dropped into the water, an issue with the crane caused Questa 1 to list to one side when it hit the surface, making it unusable. The submarine was taken to a dock where Bianco continued to work on it in order to get it back into working order. But by this point, the investors who'd helped finance the project backed out, leaving no source of income to continue working on Questa 1. Bianco had no choice but to abandon the project, leaving the submarine at the mercy of thieves and vandals. 11 years after its fated accident at launch, further misfortune would strike Questa 1 as a storm managed to break it loose from its moorings in 1981. This subsequently lodged the submarine in the sandbank of Coney Island Creek. The infamous yellow paint is now rusted to an orange hue, but you can still see the Questa 1 poking out of the water around Coney Island today. 2. Foxtrot B80. Amsterdam is home to some crazy things, and one of those things is an abandoned Soviet submarine from the Cold War. The Foxtrot B80 lies in Amsterdam's waters, and no one wishes to claim it. As a result, the submarine has become every urban explorer's dream. The Foxtrot was built in 1956 as part of the Russian Navy, which was using heavy submarine presence at the time due to the need for surveillance during the war. After being abandoned, it was temporarily utilized as a presentation venue in 2002, but 3 years later, it was closed to the public. Since then, the unloved submarine has supposedly lingered in Amsterdam waters due to unpaid towing fees by several of its owners. Weirdly enough, the submarine isn't even a B-80 either. When it was brought by Dutch investors, which is how it ended up in Amsterdam, it was thought to be one of the fabled B-80 class submarines. However, the Dutch buyers were in for a surprise when they realized what they'd purchased was, in fact, a much older Zulu V-class vessel. Adventurers who decided to board the Foxtrot B-80 to explore its cramped corridors and spaces can feel like they're stepping back in time. Old equipment and gauges still have their Russian instructions and labels, and even the missile loading chambers are painted with red and blue Soviet stars. However, exploring the submarine does come with its risks. Since it's been abandoned for so long, the vessel is starting to deteriorate. Although there have been discussions about removing the Foxtrot B-80 from Amsterdam due to safety concerns, no concrete plan has been made yet. 1. The Narco Submarines. Over the years, drug runners have had to come up with some innovative ways to avoid being detected by authorities. In 2005, it became clear that drug gangs were constructing their own makeshift submarines to carry narcotics and other illegal contraband to their clients underwater. Although not much is known about the illegal submarine trade, they're thought to be manufactured in Colombia, Ecuador, or Guyana, according to officials. At one time, the submarines were so elusive that some authorities even questioned the existence of the illicit vessels, as they were unable to find any. They assumed that the submarines were just rumors to keep them off of the true means of transportation for some of the cartels. The Coast Guard even has a nickname for them, the White Buffalo of the Seas. However, over time, more and more submarines have been apprehended in various countries across South America and Mexico. For example, a submarine carrying more than a ton of cocaine heading for Mexico was intercepted off the coast of Peru in December of 2019. At the time, authorities reported that the vessel was loaded near the Peruvian border in Ecuador, and that it was the first such drug trafficking submarine ever seized in Peru. Further tip-offs have led to other submarine discoveries. Near the town of Barra de la Cruz in Mexico, officials were alerted to the presence of an abandoned drug-running submarine. Although they didn't find any illegal substances on board, it seemed highly likely that if it hadn't been intercepted, the craft would have been used to transport drugs further up the Mexican coast. With the majority of drugs exported from locations such as Peru, it seems clear that the underwater war on drugs is said to continue for some time.
5. H.L. Hunley. The H.L. Hunley was a Confederate submarine run by an 8-person crew. It was built out of 40 feet, 12 meters of pure bulletproof iron. But despite its reputation, it was a hazardous vehicle to be in. Even so, it made history after becoming the first submarine ever to sink an enemy vessel. The sub sank about 3 times in just 8 months of service during the Civil War, from July 1863 to February 1864, killing over 30 men, including its creator. Marine and military historians have long been fascinated by the ship's fatal sinking, which happened immediately after it fired a torpedo into the USS Housatonic, a Union cruiser. Hunley was found on the ocean floor in 1995, over 130 years after it initially went down. It was brought to the surface 5 years later. All 8 crew members were still unsettlingly seated within the sub, gathered around a massive crank that ran along its center. A few theories speculate on why the ship sank and why the crew didn't try to escape. Additional information has been uncovered by researchers. The crew of the Hunley should have been able to leave with the help of a concealed device in the keel, but it was never used. This implies that whatever sank the sub must have not been spotted. Michael Scafuri has spent 18 years researching this strange historical event. His team of experts discovered that the emergency levers were locked in place after removing layers and layers of corrosion, silt, and shells from the sub. More proof that there wasn't much fear on board at the time of the sinking. The levers would have lifted the submarine to the surface and let the crew swim to safety by releasing 1,000 pounds, 454 kilograms of keel blocks. 2 theories stand out. Either the crew was unaware of danger, or they did not anticipate a need to surface immediately. The Hunley was small. It was so tiny that the soldiers weren't able to stand straight up inside. But regardless of its size, the crew still made no attempt to leave. That's why Duke University researchers believe that they more than likely died extremely quickly, quite possibly from the explosion of the submarine's own torpedo. According to a doctoral student named Rachel Lance, the pressure wave from the explosion was transported inside the submarine. She added that the blast was big enough to kill the whole crew. In 2017, experts built a scale replica of the sub and detonated it in a pond. They were able to confirm this long-held theory by measuring the forces. Regardless of these developments, Scafuri thinks it will still be some time before they can confidently say what went down within the submarine. He said that he definitely wants to get to that point, but he doesn't know for sure if it will be achievable. For the time being, scientists are concentrating on excavation, eliminating corrosion and underwater debris that have accumulated while spending decades on the ocean floor. They learn more about the ship and crew at each step, from the men's faces to a lucky gold token found in the captain's pocket. 4. Time Capsule. After more than a year of protest and legal battles, workmen in Richmond, Virginia demolished a 19th century monument to Robert E. Lee. It was the last of 6 controversial Confederate memorials removed from the city's Monument Avenue. The statue's pedestal contained a time capsule dated 1887. After 5 hours of meticulous labor by specialists in historic preservation, the lead box was opened to expose an unusual collection of objects. According to the Associated Press, objects inside the 134-year-old capsule included a British silver coin, an 1875 almanac, books, and a fabric envelope. A letter and picture of James Netherwood, a stonemason who worked on the monument, were also discovered. The relics were placed in a freezer to stop further deterioration after getting water damaged from moisture within the box. The capsule was found within the 1,500-pound, 680-kilogram granite block that was 20 feet, 6 meters up in the pedestal's tower. Even though its contents don't have much historical significance, and the capsule was not one experts had been hoping to find, Virginia Governor Ralph Northam called the occasion an important day for the history of Richmond and Virginia. Newspaper articles from 1887 claim that a box buried beneath the statue of Lee contained a photograph of Abraham Lincoln in his casket, but no such image was found after excavation. Records from the Library of Virginia also show that nearly 60 items were submitted to a time capsule by 37 Richmond people, organizations, and corporations. But this one has considerably fewer relics. At the base of the Lee Monument, workers tried to find the capsule, but the attempt was labeled a lost cause. The other capsule was found higher up on the monument as a result of recent efforts, but the one mentioned in historical documents is still at large. According to the Times, Julie Langan, head of the Virginia Department of Historic Resources, said, "The question remains. Well, what happened to that one?" Aside from the alleged Lincoln portrait, the new capsule raises a number of fascinating questions. Why was a British penny placed within the box? And why was there a copy of Collinson Pierpont Edwards Burgwin's novel The Huguenot Lovers, A Tale of Old Dominion inside? According to Langan, we have not made sense of why this assortment was placed in the box. State authorities intend to replace the 19th century capsule with a new one containing items pertinent to the present day, like masks, vaccination certificates, and a Black Lives Matter sticker, according to Michelle Stoddard from ABC News. In a September statement, Governor Northam claimed that this monument and time capsule represented Virginia in 1890. In order for our public places to more accurately represent who we are in 2021, it is time to remove both. Have you ever made a time capsule? What did you put inside? Let us know in the comments and be sure to subscribe. 3. Civil War Headstone. A Civil War soldier's headstone found by archaeologists in Delaware may be the key to finding a long-lost African-American cemetery. A gravestone with the name C.S. Hall and the information Co. K. 32nd USCT was uncovered by experts working on a site near Frankfort, Sussex County. According to Delaware's Division of Historical and Cultural Affairs, this relates to Company K of the infamous 32nd U.S. Colored Troops. It served as a designation for brave African-American soldiers. While working under the supervision of the Delaware State Historic Preservation Office, archaeologists discovered at least 9 more burials at the site. The location was also once known as the Orr property, or Hall Plantation. There is no information on the individuals buried here, and experts have not yet been able to link the headstone to one particular burial. According to authorities, the area's residents are aware that the site contains the remains of African Americans who used to live there. For the neighborhood and all residents of Delaware who cherish and appreciate the state's rich heritage, the discovery of this cemetery is noteworthy. According to Tim Slavin, head of the Division of Historical and Cultural Affairs, they wish to uncover more about the deceased. Their goal is to appropriately remember these individuals. Slavin commended nearby residents who made the cemetery's existence known. He said that the discovery of these tombs depended heavily on memories and local knowledge of the spot and its surroundings. The discovery of slave remains at the site has not yet been confirmed, but the discovery of the Civil War soldier's grave marker sheds light on the lives of people buried here. 2. Soldiers' remains. At Virginia's Manassas National Battlefield Park, a surgeon's burial pit holding the remains of 2 Civil War soldiers was discovered. The professional excavation and analysis of a surgeon's hole in a Civil War battlefield is a first in human history. Additionally, it's the first time a burial pit for amputated limbs has contained deceased Civil War troops. The National Park Service made the finding in 2014. In order to dig the site, authorities collaborated with forensic anthropologists from the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. The excavated pit also included 11 severed limbs and the remains of soldiers, proving that it had once been a field hospital. The full bodies belonged to 2 Caucasian men who died at the Second Manassas Battle and were between 25 and 34 years old. On July 21, 1861, Manassas's first battle took place. A second occurred between August 28 and August 30, 1862. Confederate forces won both times. Union forces called the conflict the First and Second Battles of Bull Run. One soldier was discovered with an Enfield bullet inside his femur. 3 discharged lead buckshots were found in another soldier. Both wounds were likely deemed too serious for effective surgery by a field doctor. Considering that the Confederate Army used Enfield rounds at the Second Battle of Manassas, experts think the soldiers were most likely from the Union Army. The bones of a man who died from buckshot were also near buttons from a Union jacket. According to forensic anthropologists' isotope analysis, the males drank and ate food from the Northeast, while their bones were still forming. In 2018, the soldiers were buried at Arlington National Cemetery in coffins made out of trees from the battlefield. The burials will mark the beginning of the cemetery's Millennium expansion, which aims to increase the number of burial places on the property by about 30,000. 1. Image of Confederate housekeeper. Mary O'Melia immigrated to America as a young woman with 3 kids before becoming a housekeeper at the Confederacy's White House. She's been both a witness to history and a mystery. That is, until 2014, when a woman with a unique Irish accent got in contact with the American Civil War Museum. The housekeeper, the woman claimed, was related to her deceased husband, and she had O'Melia's necklace from the Confederate First Lady Varina Davis. Kathy Wright, curator of the Civil War Museum, stated, "What really took my breath away is that she said she had a photograph of Mary." Wright added that it has been almost 150 years since Mary left the White House, and it is amazing that anyone is even able to see her face. The photograph portrays a woman who left her children in Baltimore to supervise the Confederate White House during the Civil War. She publicly shared nothing of her experience. O'Melia was one of the First Lady's close confidants and may have been in the home when President Abraham Lincoln arrived after Confederate forces left the city burning. On that issue, historical records aren't fully conclusive. Still, the finding is significant since the museum, which is close to the White House, has tried to put together the forgotten stories of African American slaves, free people of color, and European immigrants who served the Davis family. Mary O'Melia was one of the most elusive among them. Her name is also an enigma. It's been spelled O'Melia, O'Malley, and even O'Malla over the years. She was born Mary Larkin on April 7, 1822, in Galway, Western Ireland. She received her education in a convent, and it seems that the excellent needlework the nuns' order taught her may have had an impact on Varina Davis's decision to hire the young woman. She married Matthias O'Melia, a ship captain, but at 25 years old, he drowned at sea, leaving her a widow. Mary arrived in Baltimore in 1850, but the details of her travels are unknown. In 1861, she left her children with relatives and traveled to Richmond to visit some friends. It was there that she became stranded once Virginia seceded from the Union. She pleaded with the Roman Catholic bishop to intervene on her behalf after hearing that Varina Davis could help her get back up north. Despite O'Melia's isolation from her kids, Davis eventually persuaded her to become a housekeeper and companion to the First Lady. Despite her position in the Confederate capital, O'Melia left few written records of her time in Richmond. She left it up to others to make assumptions. One reporter even did so after she passed away, describing all the historic exchanges she would have witnessed. Omelia stayed to maintain the home when the original family left Richmond in April 1865. President Jefferson Davis wrote to his family from Danville a few days after, saying, "Mrs. Omelia behaved just as you described her, but seemed anxious to serve and promised to take care of everything, which may mean some things." A more convincing sign of Omelia's ties to the Confederacy's first family was her communication with the Davis family after they fled, as well as a wedding she and Verena Davis attended in 1867. They were the only white guests at Ellen Barnes' wedding, who had once worked in the White House. Omelia attended a memorial for Jefferson Davis in Baltimore after his death in 1889. She drew much attention, according to a reporter, and was characterized as a well-preserved old lady. Wright even said Omelia's narrative speaks to her because she considers herself as the modern housekeeper for the Confederacy's White House. After working in the White House for years, Omelia eventually moved away to Baltimore, where she ran several boarding houses. In 1907, she died. That's all for now. Do you have any personal favorite Civil War discoveries? Let us know. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe.